thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you.
Even if we granted that these things seem counterintuitive, it's like, why should we accept then that they're impossible as a result of that? I mean, like, I don't know, platypi are strange. Does it follow that platypi are impossible?
If I ask how many, as of any time, how many marbles will I have put in the jar, then I agree with you, potentially infinite. But the ones that I will put in, how many will pop into existence that I'll put in the jar? If I never stop doing it, then I will put, there is an actually infinite amount of marbles that will be put in the jar, even though there's no time.
No, that's not true. There will never be an infinite number of marbles that you put into the jar. All you have here is a potential infinite. Increasing toward infinity is a limit, but the infinity is never instantiated, ever. And it doesn't do any good to change to the past or the future perfect. The pure future is enough.
As Malpass and Morrison point out in their paper Endless and Infinite, published in Philosophical Quarterly, I believe, they point out that Craig, throughout the years, has systematically confused this question with a different question, namely, how many days will there have been as the moving now progresses throughout the future?
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that.
Evolution is a religion.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to this very special guest episode of When Theists Fail. Joining me today is philosopher Joe Schmid of the excellent channel, The Majesty of Reason. Our target, Dr. William Lane Craig, and more specifically, his claim that the possibility of an infinite collection of past events is absurd. Is it though? Is it impossible that the past is eternal? Needless to say, theists vociferously resist the possibility that the past is infinite, for if the past is infinite, the universe does not require a creator, ergo, their God is irrelevant. With this in mind, Joe and I delve into several of Dr. Craig's attempts to demonstrate the absurdity of an infinite past. We go through these attempts blow by blow and demonstrate, speaking of absurdity, the absurdity of Craig's claims. All of this is done with a view to demonstrating that an infinite collection of past events is not as absurd as some people think it is. It's not as counterintuitive as some people think it is. It may in fact be the case. It may in fact be true. Although it's important to note that Joe and I do not attempt to demonstrate the truth of an infinite past in this conversation. Primarily, what we demonstrate is that Craig has failed to rule it out. And in so doing, or not doing, he has failed to substantiate his belief that a creator God is necessary to explain why there is something rather than nothing. If that sounds like it's right up your street, this is the conversation for you, but viewer discretion is advised. What you're about to embark upon is a philosophically complex and richly layered conversation that I myself struggled with. Now, perhaps you're smarter than me, in which case, you're going to swim through this conversation without any problems. But if, like me, you find conversations about math and infinity tricky or difficult, you will probably struggle like I did. Yes, dear listener, what you're about to witness is Magic Skeptic operating at his epistemic limits. Several times during this dialogue, I become confused, I scratch my head, I trip over my own words. Thankfully, I've got an awesome guest to help me and hold my hand along the way, namely Joe Schmid. So if you're ready for a tricky conversation, if you're ready to get into the complicated philosophical weeds on the possibility of an infinite past, you've come to the right place. Let's dive right in. I give you Joe Schmid, i.e. the Majesty of Reason. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another podcast. I'm extremely honored and privileged to be joined here today by one Joe Schmid of the channel The Majesty of Reason, an incredible channel that you should absolutely all check out. The link will be in the description below. And Joe, you're very, very welcome. It really is an honor and a privilege to have you here today.
Well, thanks, and it's an honor to be here, and I'm excited to talk about the Kalam.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so as a kind of angry internet atheist type myself, I'm frequently confronted with the argument that, you know, the past has to be finite. And of course, theists are highly motivated to say something like this because they believe that God created the universe. And so obviously, if the past were in fact infinite and the universe necessarily existed or something like that, we wouldn't necessarily require a creator anymore. I suppose a theist could respond by saying that the universe maybe still requires a maintainer. But clearly, if we were to remove the creator role of God, this would be a rather critical blow to the classical God of theism. What do you make of that thus far, Joe? And what are your thoughts just in the opening of this on the Kalam? Or if even actually it might be useful for our listeners, if you would just clarify what the Kalam is, that might be a great place to start. Sorry, I know I've thrown a lot at you there already.
Yeah, no, it's all good. It's all good. Yeah, so, I mean, the Kalam cosmological argument, it's a certain argument for the existence of God, or the God of traditional theism. And it's really simple. It just runs as follows. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, from which it follows that the universe has a cause. That's a kind of first stage of reasoning where we get to a cause of the universe. And then in a second stage of reasoning, defenders of the argument then try to go on to derive various divine or divine-like properties of this cause of the universe. They try to say that it's things like spaceless and timeless and enormously powerful and immaterial and personal. And so they try to derive all these divine attributes either through conceptual analysis or by looking at the role that this thing plays in causing the universe or through various other means. So yeah, that's how it's an argument for God's existence. It has two stages. First stage is those two premises with that conclusion, and then the second stage is trying to tease out various divine properties of the cause that we arrive at in the first stage. And as you said, like conceiving of God as the creator of the universe is really important to traditional theism, and so I think this is a pretty important argument, and it's a fun one, an interesting one, because it raises lots of issues in metaphysics, in philosophy of time, in philosophy of religion, all sorts of things. So yeah.
I'm just going to forewarn you, I'm going to find it really, really difficult in the edit to resist inserting little clips of Craig, who you were undoubtedly mimicking there.
Right, yes.
Spaceless.
Timeless.
Timeless.
We do this, if Craig is watching this, we do this in love, right? We're not like, we're not trying to say that he's a terrible person or anything like that. We're just, we find it fun, so.
I will consider it a great personal victory if William Lane Craig ever watches one of my videos, so.
Right.
But yeah, so that's the stage set. I suppose it's worth pointing out, just for the viewers and the listeners, that the Kalam is in fact a valid argument. Validity goes to the structure of the syllogism. So if the premises are true, that conclusion does in fact necessarily follow. The question, of course, at play here, Joe, as I'm sure you'll agree, is whether or not the argument is sound, which goes to the truth of the premises, right?
That's part of the issue. Part of the issue is whether it's sound, but there's also, I guess, a further element of when we're examining arguments as to whether or not it's like it's convincing or gives us good reason. Because I mean, here's both a sound and valid argument. You know, I exist, therefore I exist. Okay, we've got one premise, got a conclusion. It's valid. The premise is true. But like, if someone is actually skeptical that I exist, like for some reason they've never heard of me and they find it very improbable that such a silly being would exist as me, then giving them this argument that Joe exists, therefore Joe exists, that's not really a good argument to convince them, is it? No, it's not. Because, I mean, they're in doubt as to whether or not I exist. And so merely asserting that I exist in the premise in order to try to convince them that I exist is just patently question-begging. It's not a good argument, even though it's a sound argument. So we're not just focused on soundness. That really does matter. It's devastating to the argument if one of the premises is false, and consequently if it's unsound. But what also matters is whether or not we have like good reason to accept the premises, and whether or not they're actually like convincing, things like that. So yeah.
Sure. No, that makes perfect sense. So with that in mind, then, Joe, I'm just going to dive right in here to the argument. I've prepared a list of questions and you've already described, or you've already you've already said the premises and the conclusion of the argument. So I'm just going to start at the beginning here with some questions that I frequently receive in my comment section. The very first question that I have written here, which might be worth considering, is this: does the Big Bang prove that the universe had a beginning? Because I feel like laymen and people who, you know, when you speak to the average person, I'm a high school teacher, and when you speak to kids about the Big Bang, their peripheral knowledge about the Big Bang is such that they think that the Big Bang is the beginning of space and time. It's the beginning of the universe. Is that actually reasonable? Because, of course, if that's the case, if the Big Bang proves that the universe had a beginning, then thinkers like William Lane Craig are actually right. In fact, I think Craig, in his own speeches, when he's speaking to lay audiences and so on, cites the Big Bang as evidence for the fact that the universe had a finite beginning in the past. Is it fair to say that the Big Bang serves as good evidence for the beginning of the universe?
Yeah, this is a great question. The first thing that I want to say is for people who are interested in this question and science's bearing on the beginning of the universe, they should immediately check out two things. One of them is the video that I did with Dr. Daniel Linford on my channel. It's called, like, Does Science Show the Universe Began to Exist? We went through Craig's main arguments for this conclusion based on Big Bang cosmology, based on the second law of thermodynamics, based on all sorts of different things. And we systematically addressed them in that video. So if people want to check that out, I highly recommend it. I would also highly recommend, and this is the second thing, Dr. Daniel Linford's dissertation. He recently completed his dissertation at Purdue University, Boiler Up. I went there for my undergrad. And it is freely available online, in fact, on his Phil Papers profile. You could just search up Cosmic Skepticism and the Beginning of Physical Reality or something like that.
I will link it in the description.
In the beginning. Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
And it's freely available online. The PDF is there. You can read it. I highly recommend checking it out. Therein, he systematically delves through the relevant science, and in my view, fairly convincingly shows that actually science right now is silent on whether or not the totality of all of physical reality has an absolute beginning. So I would highly recommend checking that out. That's going to contain far more information and far more rigorously researched information than I could give here. I'll just briefly say two things.
Sure.
For starters, the theories that we have right now concern our local spatiotemporal manifold. And they actually do give us good reason to think that our local space-time manifold, like the observable universe, the physical things that we can interact with, all bounded within our kind of space-time manifold, that thing is indeed finite towards the past. Our local, the space-time that we inhabit goes back to a certain beginning point or a certain finite point in the past. The science does indeed support that. But what the science is silent on, or at least what, in my view, Dan argues quite convincingly that the science is silent on, is whether or not that marks an absolute beginning to all of physical reality whatsoever.
Indeed.
It may very well be the case. It may very well be the case that that's preceded by certain other physical realities. It may very well be the case that there are other physical realities existing in tandem that proceed back infinitely, etc. So, although we do have good reason to think that our local spatiotemporal manifold began to expand a finite time ago from a very small condensed state, science does not show that that is the absolute beginning of all of physical reality. It may very well be preceded by some sort of physical reality. It may very well, like I said, our local spatiotemporal manifold might not exhaust all of physical reality. There may very well be other physical realities that are spatiotemporally disjoint from ours, etc. Okay, so that's one thing to say. That science does indeed show that. Again, I'm just going to it bears repeating. Science does indeed show that our local spatiotemporal manifold began to expand around 13.8 billion years ago. It began to expand from a very hot, very condensed state. But it's an open question whether or not that condensed state marks the absolute beginning of all physical reality, for at least two reasons, because there may very well be physical realities that precede that very hot, dense, condensed state, and there may very well be disjoint physical realities as well, apart from our local spatiotemporal manifold. Okay. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that even if Big Bang cosmology gave us a good reason to think that all of physical reality was finite towards the past, which again, it doesn't, as I was just explaining, even if it gave us a good reason to think that all of physical reality was finite towards the past, it does not then follow that all of physical reality has a beginning. Now that sounds weird, but let me explain.
That's a fascinating point, Joe, just for the listeners. So I'm just going to interject just briefly. So what you're saying, Joe, and I just want to repeat it back to you to make sure that I'm keeping up, and that, at the very least, maybe I can be just because it can be confusing for me. If it's confusing for me, it's no doubt confusing for some of my listeners and viewers. So what you're saying is, even if it were the case that it were proven without question that the sum total of all of physical reality had a finite beginning in the past, it still wouldn't follow that it had a beginning. Is that what you just said?
Well, when you said it has a finite beginning towards the past, you're sort of bringing in a beginning, and this is what I was about to explain. So,
okay, sure.
The way that I would put it, and the way that Dan puts it in a dissertation, as well as his paper, I think it's called a modal condition for the beginning of the universe, or something like that. Merely from the fact that all of physical reality is finite towards the past, it doesn't follow that it began to exist. The reason for that is because there are various additional conditions on beginning to exist that you need to meet in order to count as beginning to exist, in addition to having a finite past. So, the way to see this is to take Craig's own view. Craig thinks God is in time. He's been in time since the beginning of time, because God is continually related to the universe. He continuously sustains it. He has changing knowledge about it. So God is in time since in his view, the beginning of the universe. But in his view, time does not extend infinitely to the past. This is Craig's whole shtick, right? The past time is not infinite. So God has a past, and his past is not infinite. He has a finite past. God has a finite past. But Craig does not say that God began to exist. That shows that having at least in Craig's view, and the way that he formulates this argument, the way that he understands beginning to exist, and the way that you need to understand it for the argument to succeed, that shows that having a finite past is not sufficient for beginning to exist, because God has a finite past. God has existed in time for a finite period, going back to a definite starting point. And yet, God did not begin to exist.
Time must have had a beginning, and that in some mysterious way God existed not before time. That would be a self-contradiction. But he existed in some way beyond time. And so the way I would put it is this, is that God is timeless without creation, and he is temporal since the moment of creation. So the decision to create on God's part is a decision to enter into time, to take on a temporal mode of existence in order to relate to his creatures.
How do you make sense of that? Well, because there are additional conditions that you need to meet in order to actually begin to exist, in addition to having a finite past. In particular, one condition that Craig adds is that you need to be such that you did not exist in a timeless state, causally prior to entering into time, as it were. That's how he thinks that God didn't begin to exist, because although God has a finite past, he sort of pre-existed that finite past in a timeless state.
Yeah, he existed timelessly. I was just about to say it, yes.
Yeah. So he existed causally prior to the beginning of time in a timeless state. And so his first moment of time, as it were, does not mark an absolute beginning of his existence. It's not like he's arriving anew onto the scene of reality, precisely because he was sort of there already, as it were, existing timelessly. So even though God has a finite past, does not follow that he began to exist. And one reason for that is because he existed timelessly in the absence of the temporal progression of events and causally prior to it. But once we notice that, you can take similar views about physical things. So for instance, you can agree that all of physical reality is finite towards the past. Doesn't follow that all physical reality began to exist, because maybe some physical entity existed causally prior to the beginning to the beginning of time. Maybe it existed causally prior to the beginning of time in a timeless state. And in fact, there are various physically live proposals for how we can understand physical things, like the universal wave function, for instance, existing non-spatiotemporally. There are physically live models of that. It's talked about in philosophy of physics, etc. And so, again, even if the Big Bang showed that all of physical reality was finite towards the past, it would not follow that all of physical reality began to exist, and hence you would not justify the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, because it may very well be the case that some physical thing, just as Craig conceives of God, it may very well be the case that some physical thing existed causally prior to the beginning of time in a state of timelessness. And there are other states that we can conceive of well. It may very well exist in like a non-metric time. We don't need to get into that. It's very difficult to explain. We're not going to get into that here. But so there are various different ways that you can. I'm just saying the person who thinks that even though physical reality is finite towards the past. It didn't begin to exist. The person who thinks that is not wedded to thinking that some physical thing existed timelessly. That they can have other proposals as well. But I just wanted to explain that. So that's yet another reason why the Big Bang Theory does, even if we granted that it showed that all of physical reality were finite towards the past, it doesn't follow that all physical reality began to exist. And again, just return to Craig's view. Craig himself thinks that God's life, as it were, is finite towards the past.
He is temporal since the moment of creation.
But God did not begin to exist.
God is timeless.
And so similarly, all of physical reality may not have arisen anew onto the scene of reality at the first moment of time, because it may very well have, quote-unquote, pre-existed the first moment of time in a timeless state, or in a non-metric time, or other sorts of things that we don't need to get into. But anyway, that's the second reason. The last point that I want to interject with is that the opponent of the Kalam cosmological argument does not need to show that the model that I just described of reality, in which all of physical reality is finite towards the past, and some physical thing exists timelessly, causally prior to the beginning of physical time, the opponent of the Kalam cosmological argument does not actually have to say that that is true.
Yeah.
All they need to say is that Craig has failed to rule this out. Craig has failed to give us, or proponents of the Kalam more generally, have failed to give us sufficient reason to think that this is not the case. And in order to justify their second premise, in order to justify the claim that all physical reality began to exist, they would need to rule this out. So the burden of proof is on them to show that this is false.
1,000% agreed.
And thereby they need to engage with the relevant literature, which does indeed seem to make perfect sense of non-spatiotemporal but nevertheless physical things like the universal wave function. Check out the work of Alyssa Ney and Jill North and Julian Barber and all these other philosophers of physics who are working on precisely this sort of thing. And Sean Carroll and other people, including physicists. So this is, I think, a deeply underappreciated problem. And it's also, again, I just want to reiterate, the opponent of the Kalam does not need to justify that this is in fact the case. All they need to point out is that it has not been disproven.
Yeah, and I love this point because it maps onto my own thinking insofar as if somebody asks me, why is there something rather than nothing? My answer, and I'm on record saying this 100 times or more at this point, is I don't know. I don't know why there's something rather than nothing. But when somebody like William Lane Craig comes along, Dr. William Lane Craig, to be fair, to give him his credentials, when Dr. Craig comes along and he says that reality had an absolute beginning and that God is responsible for that, if he's going to make that claim, it is incumbent upon him to rule out alternatives that are, you know, equally good at explaining the data that we see before our eyes. It's not my job to prove an alternative. I just want to know how he's ruled out those other possibilities. And to your point, Joe, it's not clear that he's done that. And to summarize your points, and again, correct me here if I've misunderstood, I've written a couple of notes here. So basically, the Big Bang doesn't actually necessarily demonstrate that there's an absolute beginning to time. But even if it did do that, if there was an absolute beginning to our universe, it wouldn't follow. I'll just read what I wrote. So it wouldn't follow basically. Oh, I'm going to confuse myself here now. So just because our universe began, it doesn't follow that it can't be eternal, because there could be, as you put it, a non-metric time. There could be a reality, an atemporal reality that pre-exists our universe. And a theist can't necessarily resist this, certainly not Craig, because Craig himself believes that God existed timelessly, sans the universe, as he puts it. And then God entered time with the universe. So God's metric past is in fact finite, but it doesn't entail the fact that God began to exist. And if Craig can say that about God, the naturalist could say something similar about the universe. Is that a fair summary, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And again, the onus is on Craig then to rule, Craig and proponents of the Kalam, to rule this alternative way of conceiving of physical reality. They need to rule this out. And again, I just want to reiterate that this is not the only way for physical reality to have a finite past and yet fail to begin to exist. This is not the only way for that to be the case. There are other ways involving proposals about non-metric time and about some fundamentally non-spatiotemporal reality, etc. I talk about those in my video on Hilbert's Hotel and Analysis. So if people are curious, they can check that video out. And I think we also talk about that in the video that I mentioned with Dr. Daniel Linford. So we go through different proposals for how things might look, and each and every one of them would have to be systematically ruled out by proponents of the Kalam, and no one has done that yet. So.
Yeah, I love it. I absolutely love it. This is great. And apologies, by the way, to the listeners if I'm uncharacteristically tripping over myself in this conversation. But as I said to Joe,
this is difficult stuff.
Yeah, as I said to Joe off air before we went live here, this is me operating at my absolute epistemic limits. And so I'm sweating more than I would normally do, and I'm tripping over words more than I would normally do. But I'm so delighted to have a guest like Joe here with me to help me through this and to hold my hand, because as I said, I have to doff my cap to Joe on this stuff. You know what, I might as well say this as well, because I said this to Joe off camera. I should absolutely commit this to record. I consider Joe something of a mentor. I've been watching Joe's content for years, and I would highly recommend my listeners to do the same thing. So Joe, again, thanks for being here. But yeah, let's proceed with the next problem. I think we've dealt with that sufficiently, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, again, for the audience, the take home is, for starters, the Big Bang Theory does not tell us that the totality of all of physical reality has a finite past. It only talks about the local spatiotemporal manifold that we inhabit. Yes. And the second point is just that even if it showed that all of physical reality is finite towards the past, it wouldn't follow that all of physical reality began to exist, and hence it wouldn't justify the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. So those are the takeaway points. And for more on these points, see my video with Dr. Dan Linford, and also see his dissertation, because he develops them in more detail.
I will include all of those links in the description. So feel free to mention as many references, Joe, throughout this conversation, and I will do my homework and make sure that all of those links are included in the description below for anybody who wants to search further, which I would highly recommend. So with that said, I think a conversation like this would be remiss if it did not include a discussion of Hilbert's Hotel. William Lane Craig himself, Dr. William Lane Craig, uses Hilbert's Hotel, which I'll allow you to explain in a moment, Joe, but he uses this thought experiment to try and demonstrate the alleged ridiculousness or incoherence of infinite collections existing in reality. And of course, if Hilbert's Hotel and the criticism that it brings to the table is true, if it's robust and can survive critique and be demonstrated to be true, well, then we would actually have a de facto defeater for the thing that I'm postulating here, which is the possibility of an infinite past, thereby removing the necessity of a divine creator. So we have to take Hilbert's Hotel seriously. We have to think about it, and we need to think about whether or not it actually works as a defeater for the existence of infinite collections. And with that stage set, Joe, would you care to tell us what Hilbert's Hotel is as a thought experiment? And if you could then begin to tell us maybe some of the problems with Hilbert's Hotel and whether or not it actually works as a good analogy for an infinite past.
Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling because it's like, I don't even know where to start. I mean, like I told you, I have this video. It's called Hilbert's Hotel Analysis. It's like the most systematic investigation into Hilbert's Hotel, like basically in existence for the most part.
It's a phenomenal. Can I just say it's a phenomenal
it's like 3
video.
hours.
And I watched it. It's a phenomenal video, and I watched it in preparation for this conversation. And that's not my first time watching it. I've watched it twice in the past, and I watched it just this week in preparation for our dialogue. So I'm well versed with that video, and I absolutely love it. So yeah, just you take it whatever direction you want to go, Joe. I'm all ears. I can't wait to hear your thoughts live.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, it's like 3 hours and 20 minutes long or something like that. It's tons of research poured into it. Like even the latest scholarly research of articles published from people like, of course, Craig, Sinclair, Erasmus, Malpass, Morriston, Stephen Purrier, Andrew Loke, etc., going through like basically. Anyway, it's very well researched in my humble opinion. It's the greatest video that's ever been existed, folks. Believe me. So yes. Anyway, what is Hilbert's Hotel? Well, I guess we should first start. How does it fit into the Kalam dialectic? Okay, so remember the Kalam cosmological argument, or at least stage one of the Kalam cosmological argument. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist is a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, the universe has a cause. Okay. I probably even messed it up. Whatever begins to exist is a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Look at that second premise. The universe began to exist, okay?
Yeah.
The Hilbert's Hotel is meant to try to justify that premise. How is it trying to justify that premise? Well, it's trying to show that infinite collections, any actual infinite, is absurd, it's impossible, and since an infinite temporal regress of events would count as an actual infinite, and since actual infinites cannot exist per the alleged absurdities of Hilbert's Hotel, it follows that an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist. And so basically, since an infinite past is basically just an infinite temporal regress of events, it follows that there can't be infinite pasts, so the past must be finite.
David Hilbert was perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century. And to illustrate the strange nature of the actual infinite, he invites us to imagine a hotel that has an infinite number of rooms in it. Moreover, he says, imagine that every room is occupied. Now, you have to have that firmly in mind. There is a flesh and blood person in every single room throughout the infinite hotel. Now, Hilbert says, suppose somebody shows up at the guest registry wanting to check in. The proprietor says, of course, no problem. And he moves the person who was in room 1 into room 2. The person who was in room 2, he puts in room 3. The person who was in room 3, he puts in room 4, on out to infinity. As a result, room 1 now becomes vacant, and the new person is easily accommodated. And yet, before he came, all the rooms were already full. Then Hilbert says, imagine that an infinite number of new guests show up at the front desk, and again, every room is already occupied. No problem, says the manager. And he moves the guest in room 1 into room 2. He moves the guest who was in room 2 into room 4. He takes the guest who was in room 3 and puts him in room 6, putting every guest in the room number double his own. Well, since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, right? All of the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and therefore the infinity of new guests is easily accommodated. And yet before they arrived, every room was already full. I think these sorts of absurdities show the impossibility of the existence of an actually infinite number of things, because there's nothing about the illustration that hangs on it being a hotel. When you have an actual infinite, you generate these kinds of crazy situations that I think are plausibly metaphysically impossible.
Even if we granted you that infinite pasts are impossible, it does not follow that the universe began to exist.
Indeed.
Again, we just explained this. We just explained how merely from the fact that all physical reality is finite towards the past does not follow that it began to exist. Perhaps some physical thing exists timelessly sans the beginning of metric time. In that case, it just follows that physical reality didn't begin to exist per Craig's own understanding of that. Because Craig himself again thinks that that's exactly how God is. God is finite towards the past. His life, as it were, extends finitely towards the past, and yet God didn't begin to exist.
He is temporal since the moment of creation.
Basically, even if we granted Craig this argument from the impossibility of actual infinites, his second premise wouldn't follow. So that's kind of the main thing, and it's meant to justify the second premise. So this actually doesn't. His second premise is still left unjustified, even if he gives it, at least not sufficiently justified, even though he gives this argument. So that's kind of the main point that I want to bring up here. But anyway, we've got the sub-argument. It's meant to justify the second premise of the Kalam, and again, the sub-argument is actual infinites are impossible. An infinite temporal regress of events, or in other words, an infinite past, is an actual infinite, and so an infinite past is impossible. Okay.
When you have an actual infinite, you generate these kinds of crazy situations that I think are plausibly metaphysically impossible.
So what is an actual infinite? And an actual infinite is basically just a collection with infinitely many members. So for instance, the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc., and so on ad infinitum, that would be an actually infinite collection. It's a collection with infinitely many members. It's not a finite collection that continually grows as time progresses. That would be what's called a potential infinite. It is a collection which always has finitely many members, but nevertheless is always increasing in the number of members that it has as time progresses, and it increases towards infinity as a limit, as it were. So it goes from, like, let's say 1, then 2, then 3 members, then 4 members, then 5 members, and so on as time progresses. But notice at each point in time, it only has finitely many members.
So so if you were to stop a person who was counting to infinity, at any point you stop them and ask them what number they're at, they would never be at infinity. They would just be at a finite number, but always counting towards infinity, but never actually getting there. So that would be a potential infinite, whereas an actual infinite is, the natural numbers, as you said. There are infinite natural numbers. There's no end to that series.
Yeah, like the collection itself has infinitely many members. The way that you specify the collection, the natural numbers, has infinitely many members. And we can actually kind of give a kind of rigorous, precise characterization of this in terms of Cantor's property. So what is Cantor's property? It basically means that a whole collection can be put in one-to-one correspondence with some proper sub-collection thereof.
Yes.
I mean, I guess I could try to explain that. So, like, let's see. Take all the natural numbers. Now take all the even numbers.
Yeah.
You might think that there are fewer even numbers than there are natural numbers, because, like, you're skipping all the odd numbers, right?
Which would be wrong.
Right. No, you'd be mistaken, at least if we measure the size of sets in terms of the cardinality of sets. But
cardinality is the number of members in a set.
It's like the size of a set, basically. It's like the number of members in the set or the collection.
So if I 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the cardinality of that set is 5. If I had five apples, the cardinality of the set of apples is 5. I'm just trying to make. I don't want to assume too much about what the listener may or may not know. So I'm just interjecting just to make things at least to the best of my ability. I'm just trying to make things as clear as possible. We've already seen that I'm desperately struggling to keep up myself. But yeah, that's okay.
Right. No, I appreciate that. So yeah, back to, like, the natural numbers and comparing them with the even numbers. Well, here's an interesting thing. You can actually pair up the natural numbers with the even numbers. And most people in the audience may already be familiar with this, but it's still just going through it to help understanding and set up the argument.
Sure.
You can actually pair up the natural numbers with the even numbers, such that each natural number is paired up with exactly one even number, and each even number is paired up with exactly one natural number, and there are none left over. So, for instance, you could pair the natural number 1 with the even number 2, the natural number 2 with the even number 4, the natural number 3 with the even number 6, and so on, pairing each natural number n with the even number 2 times n, okay? And notice that exhaustively pairs in a kind of one-to-one correspondence. So there's, like, one natural number for every one even number, and you keep on doing that for all the natural numbers and all the even numbers with none left over, and you get that correspondence for all of them with like I said, with none left over. And that tells us that they have the same cardinality or the same size or the same number of elements or number of members,
which is counterintuitive because we tend, when we talk about finite arithmetic, a set is any subset is smaller by definition than the overall set. So the set of even numbers in a finite set of numbers would presumably be smaller, would definitionally be smaller than the overall set of those numbers. But yet when it comes to infinite collections, this Cantor's property, counterintuitive though it might be, is a feature of infinite collections where there can be a one-to-one correspondence between a subset and the set, even though that doesn't actually make sense, which is one of the reasons why some of my listeners, I would imagine, believe that infinite collections are impossible. Cantor's property is incredibly counterintuitive, right, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah. I mean, when you're first introduced to it, I don't know, maybe you get jaded if you work with this stuff too long. So
no. I appreciate that response. No, that's a wonderful correction. So let me choose my words more carefully, Joe. This is counterintuitive to a person who has no expertise in mathematics. This is counterintuitive to, say, a layman, a person who. I mean, you probably know a lot of people like this. I know a lot of people in my life who don't care about philosophy. They don't think about philosophy. They don't think about mathematics. They go to work, they do their job, they come home, they eat their dinner, they might go to the gym, they go to bed. They're just living a quote-unquote normal life. They're not thinking about Cantor's property. They wouldn't know what Cantor's property was if you brought it up. And if I told them that in infinite collections, the subset can have the same number of members as the overall set, they'd probably scratch their head and look at you strangely. I mean, forgive me for speaking on behalf of people I've never met, and so perhaps I shouldn't engage in mind reading. So let me just say this. My intuition tells me that the layman would find this perplexing. But obviously when it comes to infinities, and this would be my take on it, Joe, and this is a response I've used to theists who raise this as a problem, what expectation has the universe ever given us to think that it should operate according to any intuition that we have? The universe is not only strange, it appears to be stranger than we can even suppose, right? And so, yeah, I would just say, yeah, it's certainly counterintuitive to me, Joe. You seem to be inferring that it's rather intuitive to you, but it seems counterintuitive to me. But I'm okay with that. Infinite collections are going to be different from finite collections, and that's not, I suppose, such a big deal. But anyway, I interrupted you, Joe, so please do continue. I don't know if I've...
I think that's all. I think that's all great. I think that's all great. And
sure.
So
fair.
yeah, we were just explaining Cantor's property, and we were in the process. So I have always have in the back of my mind just the overarching dialectic, and we were explaining Cantor's property because that's characteristic. It's the kind of formal feature that is characteristic of actual infinite collections. They have Cantor's property, and again, Cantor's property is basically just the property of being a collection, which is such that the whole collection can be put in one-to-one correspondence with parts of the collection. Yeah. So again, like the whole collection of natural numbers can be put in one-to-one correspondence with mere parts of the collection, namely just the even numbers. Okay. So and we can talk about like, oh well, it's a proper subset. Okay, we're not going to get into that like technical terminology, but that's what Cantor's property is. The whole collection can be put in one-to-one correspondence with mere parts of the collection. Okay. So that's what's actually characteristic of an actual infinite. It is a collection which has Cantor's property, and a potential infinite certainly does not have Cantor's property. It's always finite. The number of members in a potentially infinite collection is always finite, and it's always increasing towards infinity as a limit. Okay, so then, with those out of the way, and having explained the argument, and the argument again, this is an argument for the second premise of the Kalam. The second premise of the Kalam says the universe began to exist, and the way that they're trying to justify this is through a sub-argument. The sub-argument says that an actual infinite cannot exist, an infinite past is an actual infinite, therefore an infinite past cannot exist. We've just explained what an actual infinite is. Here's how you see that an infinite past is an actual infinite. It's pretty clear. Right? Remember, an actual infinite is just a collection which has infinitely many members. And if you have an infinite past, well, then just consider the collection of past days, or the collection of past hours, or the collection of past years, or whatever. It has infinitely many members. There's yesterday, there's the day before that, there's the day before that, there's the day before that, and so on ad infinitum, right? If the past is infinite, then there are going to be infinitely many of those. And you can actually, if we numbered them, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, going back, then you can pair the entire numbered collection of days with just the even number of days in a one-to-one correspondence. So it has Cantor's property. Okay.
Yeah, so that's a really good example. So if the past is infinite, there has been just as many odd days as there have been days.
Yes, and
that's the counterintuitive. That's the counterintuitive thing that I'm talking about, which seems when you think about it with a concrete example like that, I think one would be forgiven for feeling like that's a bit counterintuitive. So there's been just as many odd numbered days as there has been overall days, even though overall days would include both the odd days and the even days. So again, I'm actually just trying to extend an olive branch to the theist here, who might say, yeah, this is counterintuitive. I don't want a theist to watch this and have you and I in violent agreement about how this is all very intuitive, because if it's not intuitive to them, I feel like that's going to be alienating in the conversation. I'm actually just granting to the theist here, yeah, I get it. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in your God, and I actually do believe that it's possible that the past is an infinite collection. I'm granting you that that's counterintuitive, and now that I've granted you that, let me give you some good reasons as to why it might be true despite that counterintuitive nature. That's where I'm coming from, Joe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and I love that spirit of cordiality and charity, and like not having this be like a little echo chamber where we're just basically just like high-fiving each other the whole time. So no, I appreciate that. I mean, I always like shift around in my seat when people say, oh well, it has the same number of members or things like that, because like I don't know, in English, I don't know, we use words differently in different contexts and they mean different things, and they're very slippery. And in math, we get rid of that slipperiness, and we get rid of all the imprecision, we get rid of all the ambiguity, we get rid of all the polysemy, and we just use a very technical notion of cardinality. And the way that we intuitively help people see cardinality is like, yeah, it's kind of like the size of a set. It's kind of like the number of members. But like when you actually dig into the mathematics, all that cardinality is, I mean, it's just strictly defined formally. It's defined in terms of one-to-one correspondence. And there's no claim that that kind of maps onto like our common sense ordinary notion of size or anything like that. This is just a strictly formal property of like collections of items, and it's just defined in terms of one-to-one correspondence. So when you understand cardinality in that sense, and we get rid of the kind of ordinary English intuitive notion of size, it becomes patently obvious that the cardinality of the even-numbered days in the past is the same as the cardinality of all the numbered days of the past. Because again, that's just defined in terms of one-to-one correspondence, and it's just self-evident that you can put them in one-to-one correspondence. I mean, we can prove that mathematically, in fact. So that's not counterintuitive. Now, then wherein lies the counterintuitiveness? Well, I think wherein lies the counterintuitiveness is trying to like equate that notion of cardinality with our kind of intuitive grasp of size, or maybe our intuitive grasps or different meanings. But like actually, we can specify different notions of size on which all the past days does indeed have a greater size than the even-numbered past days. Here's one notion of size. Like one set has a greater size than another set if the first set contains all the members in the second set and more members besides. That's a perfectly intuitive notion. That's a perfectly intuitive notion of size. And under that understanding of size, it's actually true, even if you had an infinite past, that all the past days has a greater size. That collection has a greater size than the even-numbered past days. Because again, it contains all the even-numbered days and then some. Namely, and all the odd ones in addition. So you're preserving the cardinality of both sets, even though one is a subset. They have the same cardinality, but using the description of size that you just used, we can preserve our intuitions about size without violating the cardinality of the set and the subset. Yeah, exactly. And like, that's fantastic. I love that, Joe. That's great. Yeah, and I think the counterintuitiveness involving like the size of these things is really just like based on treating our notion of size as kind of like univocal and context insensitive, invariant, and it's just always has to be the cardinality notion. But I don't see why that should be the case. Cardinality is a purely formal property defined mathematically in terms of bijection between sets. So in other words, size doesn't have to be a mathematical. It doesn't have to be a numerical concept. It can be it can be a qualitative rather than a quantitative concept. Is that the overall point, Joe? Well, I mean, the way that I define it is sort of quantitative. I mean, that's fair actually. I see what you mean. Just say like not the cardinality notion. Once we recognize this, well then I mean we can actually we can preserve the intuitions, I think. There actually is a real sense in which, and this is what your intuition is latching onto. I mean, like when people try to explain the counterintuitiveness, it's like, well, hold on a second. All the numbered days, well, that includes the even numbered days, but also the odd ones too. How can there not be more? Well, like there is more. There is more in the sense in which you're thinking. The sense in which you're thinking is not cardinality. You're not thinking of bijection between sets. You're just not. Because again, it's self-evident that there's a bijection between them, that there's a one-to-one correspondence between them. And so what you're thinking of, or what we are thinking of with our puny monkey brains is like, it has all these members and more besides. And in that sense, it actually is true that they have different sizes, that all the past days compared to just even-numbered past days. And so you actually don't get in my view, like you actually don't get a violation of intuition. I think this is it makes perfect sense. There's nothing counterintuitive about this. So one infinity can be larger than the other? In a particular sense of larger. Yes. In the sense that I specified. That you have all of the members of the set plus some more. Yeah, I mean, you can also have infinities that are... I'm paraphrasing, of course, but yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can also have infinities that are larger than others in the cardinality sense, but like if we're just restricting ourselves to like natural numbers and collections of those, then they're all those collections, so long as it's like an endless collection of natural numbers, whether it's the odd numbers or like the squares or whatever, they're all going to have the same cardinality. But they can nevertheless still have different sizes in the sense of size in which I articulated. And that's what our intuition is glomming onto, and we are correct in that. So I don't know. I see absolutely nothing counterintuitive about any of this stuff. Because I just think, and I think the counterintuitive lies in sort of confusing illicitly assuming that just like our kind of intuitive notion of size has to always correspond to like the strict mathematical definition of one-to-one correspondence and cardinality and whatnot, and that's just not the case. So I don't see any counterintuitiveness here. I mean, before I turn it over to you, I just want to say, like, we haven't actually talked about Hilbert's Hotel. We're talking about the issues that Hilbert's Hotel arises. Hilbert's Hotel was only ever an illustration meant to bring out these absurdities that we are currently talking about. So don't like foam at the mouth and try to comment. You're not actually talking about Hilbert's Hotel. We're talking about the lessons that Hilbert's Hotel are trying to get us to recognize, which is all these alleged absurdities, alleged counterintuitiveness, alleged stuff about infinity that are trying to motivate that premise that actual infinites cannot exist because they're so counterintuitive. So again, although I haven't articulated what Hilbert's Hotel is and so on, Hilbert's Hotel was only ever an illustration meant to bring out some of these absurdities and some of these counterintuitive features, and we are directly, like, we just kind of skipped Hilbert's Hotel and are going directly to those alleged counterintuitive aspects of infinity.
Sure. I mean, it might be worth visiting Hilbert's Hotel for a moment, because there's at least one or two points that I just want to make clear that I would love you to explain to my audience. Because I've had more than one person comment in the past and say Hilbert's Hotel demonstrates the absurdity of an infinite past. And while we have teased out just a couple of those talking points, if only tangentially, I would just like, if you wouldn't mind, Joe, if you would indulge me, to just briefly explain the kinds of operations that Craig kind of goes through with Hilbert's Hotel. And I would just love you to explain why those operations where, he moves guests from one room to another and so forth, why those operations are actually, in my view anyway, I don't know if you would use such a strong word as I'm about to use, but I think it's absurd to compare past events with the kinds of operations that he does with Hilbert's Hotel. So I would just love if you would briefly explain what I'm referring to there and kind of just tease out some of the disanalogy that I'm referring to.
And to illustrate the strange nature of the actual infinite, he invites us to imagine a hotel that has an infinite number of rooms in it.
It's basically a hotel with infinitely many rooms. They're labeled with the natural numbers, let's say. So we've got room 1, room 2, room 3, room 4, and so on ad infinitum. So it's just this ginormous hotel. And we could do various operations on guests. So imagine that guests come in, they fill up the entire hotel. So it's already full. There are no vacant rooms.
Moreover, he says, imagine that every room is occupied. Now you have to have that firmly in mind. There is a flesh and blood person in every single room throughout the infinite hotel.
A new guest shows up and tells the clerk, like, I need a room. And what does the clerk say? The clerk is like, no problem. And so the clerk just like gets on the buzzer and says, hey, everyone. And, apparently the buzzer just reaches every room and, if the people can hear it, they move, and they're very willing to go along with the requests. So he says on the buzzer, everyone, you got to move up a room. So basically, if you're in room 1, you got to go to room 2. If you're in room 2, you got to go to room 3. And so they all just pack up their bags and go to the next room, and then hey, we've got a vacancy. And so the new guest is accommodated.
Now, Hilbert says, suppose somebody shows up at the guest registry wanting to check in. The proprietor says, of course, no problem. And he moves the person who was in room 1 into room 2. The person who was in room 2, he puts in room 3. The person who was in room 3, he puts in room 4, on out to infinity. As a result, room 1 now becomes vacant, and the new person is easily accommodated. And yet, before he came, all the rooms were already full.
And in fact, you can accommodate infinitely many guests. So an infinite bus comes along, and all the guests are like, we need rooms. And so, being the innovative fellow that he is, the the clerk or whatever at the desk is like, aha, I'll just tell everyone to move to like the room number that's double the one that they're currently in. So like room number 1, you got to go to room 2. Room 2, you got to go to room 4. Person in room 3, you got to go to room 6.
Yeah.
And like unfortunately for a person like 2 quadrillion, they have to go to like 4 quadrillion. So it's going to take them like billions of years to get there.
I hadn't considered that feature of the
right. Yeah.
The analogy. I love it. I hadn't thought about that. That's brilliant.
So, I mean, like some of these, like once you get past a certain point, like some of the rooms, like the hallways are just filled with like dead and decaying bodies because like people can't make it that far, and so like
you have to traverse such a long space.
Right, and there's like this horrid stench, and so like they're complaining, and the reviews in the hotel, they're like half a star, right? So like
indeed.
It's big, but that's its only cool feature. But hey, size matters. Okay, so so especially if it's infinite size, you could do a lot of wonders with that.
Oh dear.
So okay,
I daren't comment.
Right, yeah, no, and infinite pleasure awaits. So yeah, what was I saying? Oh yeah, okay. Anyway, you can accommodate the new guests. So like, look what we just did. All the even numbered, all the odd rooms are now vacant.
All the odd rooms are now vacant. Yeah.
Because 2 times n is always an even number, so all the odd rooms are vacant, so you can accommodate infinitely many. Okay.
Then Hilbert says, imagine that an infinite number of new guests show up at the front desk, and again, every room is already occupied. No problem, says the manager. And he moves the guest in room 1 into room 2. He moves the guest who was in room 2 into room 4. He takes the guest who was in room 3 and puts him in room 6, putting every guest in the room number double his own. Well, since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, right? All of the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and therefore the infinity of new guests is easily accommodated. And yet before they arrived, every room was already full.
Oh, and then now we can imagine like subtracting guests as well. So we've been adding guests. We found that you can take an initially full hotel, and just by doing rearrangements, you can accommodate 1 or even infinitely many new guests. You can also subtract guests. So subtract, but we'll get to that. You can also take away guests. And, imagine that, for instance, infinitely many of the guests, all the even-numbered ones are like, we've been treated so horribly by this manager. We are just leaving. So they all just pack up their bags and go. So we subtracted infinitely many guests. Now all the even-numbered rooms are vacant. Nevertheless, the hotel still has infinitely many members in it. It has all the odd-numbered rooms still full.
But Hilbert's hotel is even stranger than the great mathematician made it out to be. For suppose some of the guests start to check out. What happens then? Suppose the guests in all the odd-numbered rooms check out. In this case, an infinite number of people have departed, but there are still an infinite number of people left in the hotel.
But imagine instead that all the guests above room 3, so room 4 and so on, all leave. Well, then, infinitely many guests have left this time, just like before. But there are only 3 guests remaining. Get the guests in room 1, 2, and 3.
But now suppose instead that the persons in rooms 4, 5, 6, and so on checked out. At a single stroke, the hotel would be virtually empty, and only 3 people would be left. And yet, the same number of guests checked out this time as when all the guests in the odd-numbered rooms checked out. You subtract identical quantities from the same quantity and get contradictory answers.
So, allegedly, infinity minus infinity is infinity, right? Because we initially had infinitely many guests, we removed infinitely many guests, and we had infinitely many remaining. But also, infinity minus infinity is 3, and so we get, because infinity minus infinity is the same as infinity minus infinity, and because they're both identical to 3 and infinity respectively, it follows that 3 is infinity, which is absurd. Okay.
Ergo and allegedly, as Craig would have us believe, infinite collections are absurd and cannot obtain in reality, and so therefore there can't be an infinite past. Checkmate.
Right. Yeah, and in Craig's view, all these things are allegedly absurd. Like, you have a full hotel, but you can accommodate 1 new guest. That's absurd. Or, you can accommodate infinitely many. That's absurd. Or, you can subtract infinitely many and get different results, different occasions. That's absurd.
When you have an actual infinite, you generate these kinds of crazy situations that I think are plausibly metaphysically impossible.
So anyway, there are all these alleged absurdities that attend Hilbert's Hotel. Where to go? I mean, there are like, as I go through like maybe 10 different problems.
You do,
sort of reasoning.
You do,
in
and
my video.
I'm just going to help you just a little bit, Joe. Here, not that you need my help, just insofar as what I would love you to focus on.
I know what you wanted me to focus on, which is the disanalogy between this and past events, and I can talk about that. I mean,
yes.
In
so
this case,
I would love to start there. Yeah, let's start there. I think that's a great way to start. So why is Hilbert's Hotel a bad analogy for an infinite collection of past events?
Right. So remember what Hilbert's Hotel, what its dialectical function is. It's to justify that claim that actual infinites, no actual infinite whatsoever, could exist. But hold on a second. There may very well be a disanalogy, relevant dissimilarities between some actual infinites and others, such that absurd features of some don't generalize to others. And so just because you can find some absurd features of this collection of actual infinites, it doesn't follow you can't generalize to all actual infinites being impossible. And that's basically the criticism that you're asking me to go towards or to develop. It's that even if, Craig, you've identified certain absurd features of Hilbert's Hotel, and even if that justifies us in thinking that Hilbert's Hotel is impossible, it doesn't follow that an infinite past is possible or that all actual infinites are impossible. Because listen, a lot of these absurdities crucially hinge on being able to rearrange the members of the relevant collection, right?
Bingo.
You're able to rearrange the members, and so you can accommodate one new member. You're able to rearrange the members so you can accommodate infinitely many. You're able to like subtract members. So like, again, this all relies on rearranging, being able to like move guests and like being able to move collections and shift them around and so on, subtract them and whatnot. But that's so crucially, and that's what that's what the absurdities hinge on. But that is totally dissimilar. That is relevantly dissimilar to an infinite past, right? In an infinite past, you can't actually rearrange or move around or shift around the collection of past days. The past is fixed, right? You can't change the past. You can't move it around. You can't shift it around. So there are relevant dissimilarities between some kinds of actual infinites and other kinds of actual infinites, which debars this sort of generalization. And so, in short, the argument rests on a hasty generalization. We cannot infer that an infinite past is impossible, or that all actual infinites are impossible merely from the fact that Hilbert's Hotel, or some actual infinites are impossible because there are relevant dissimilarities between them. One such relevant dissimilarity being the ability to rearrange and manipulate and move and subtract these sorts of things. You can't do that with past days. I mean, no. Just try. Try right now.
It's
take the past days. I mean, I dare. I'll give anyone $2 million if they can take 2020 and take all of 2020 and make it happen in 1900, and then take 1900 and make it happen in 2020. Like, if you can do that, I will sell myself into your possession.
It might have been in your video, Joe, but you can tell me if this occurred in your video. But I recall hearing at one point or another somebody said it, that to make Hilbert's Hotel more analogous to past events, all of the guests would have to be locked in their rooms, unable to move. And then it might be more analogous to past events, which are locked in place and immovable. Yeah, no, exactly. And then notice that you can't get the relevant absurdities if they're all locked in their rooms. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you might get some bad Yelp reviews, but you won't get absurdities. If Hilbert's Hotel is an infinite hotel and it has accommodated an infinite number of guests and is therefore full, if a new guest arrives, the clerk isn't going to be able to perform the relevant operations, and so that guest would have to be turned away. Yeah, it's right? Sorry, dude, but I've locked all these people in their rooms. I'm not letting them out. Yeah. So, in other words, Hilbert's Hotel doesn't succeed in demonstrating the absurdity of an infinite past because the infinite past is disanalogous to the operations that are carried out in the thought experiment that is Hilbert's Hotel. Right? Yes, that's one reason why it doesn't show that. I mean, there are myriad reasons why it doesn't show that. Many more, yeah. Yes. So, speaking of which, I just a couple of thoughts just to put on the radar. So, one thing that occurs to me is when Craig says that Hilbert's Hotel is full, it might be worth questioning what he means by full. So, if full just means that all the rooms are occupied, then fair enough, it's full. But if it means no more guests can be accommodated, well, then it isn't full, because that's not how Hilbert's Hotel operates. That's not how infinities operate. I think a lot of the confusion and a lot of the problems occur, and you can tell me if you would agree with this intuition. And I just want to be clear, I'm articulating an intuition here. My suspicion is that a lot of the problems that people perceive in infinite collections occur only because people have this arguably unreasonable expectation for infinite collections to have the same characteristics as finite collections. But infinite collections don't always have the same characteristics and qualities as finite collections. If you have a finite hotel, any hotel in the world that we inhabit, and it's full, you cannot accommodate a new guest unless they want to share a bed with somebody. That doesn't apply to an infinite hotel, because the manager or the clerk can just perform the operations that are described in Hilbert's hotel. So yes, that's strange and different from how finite collections operate. But why would one use their experience of the finite to infer what the infinite would be like? This kind of goes to a further point that I'm forever making on my channel, which is, you know, this goes to a lot of arguments for God's existence, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here. But, you know, just because our day-to-day experience operates one way doesn't mean that a radically different circumstance is duty-bound to operate in the same way. So, you know, the quantum world, according to my reading, behaves in a very, very different way to how things behave in our day-to-day experience. And so, too, it would be the case with infinite collections, because we don't encounter... well, I suppose we do encounter infinite collections. Maybe that's something we can get to in a moment, but because we use the natural numbers in our day-to-day experience, and that's an infinite collection. But a physically manifesting infinite collection, perhaps we don't encounter those too often. Maybe the singularity is evidence of an actual infinite, and again, that's something that we can potentially get to. But because our day-to-day experience tends to deal with finite collections, it just seems to be an improper inference. Because this wouldn't work with a finite collection, therefore it's absurd that it's occurring in this infinite collection. So, you know, again, the fact that if the past is infinite, the odd number of days can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the overall number of days, which to you is not counterintuitive at all. And once you understand the math, it isn't counterintuitive. But to the layman in the street, where they might find that counterintuitive, I suppose, again, the reason they're finding that counterintuitive is because their dealings with finite collections have taught them a different lesson. But again, the question is, why would you use your experience of finite collections to say anything intelligible about infinite collections? So I don't know if any of those comments are worth responding to, or should we move on?
I think that's great, and I think it's just you know, it's very similar, and I like it. It's very similar to some of the criticisms among the 10 or whatever that I raised in my video. It's like, even if we granted that these things seem counterintuitive, it's like, why should we accept then that they're impossible as a result of that? I mean, like, I don't know, platypi are strange. Does it follow that platypi are impossible? I mean, this is the point that, like, a theist philosopher Alexander Proust makes. Like, the strange and the impossible are very, very different things. Really, from the fact that it has certain strange or weird or kind of unexpected or slightly counterintuitive properties. And again, I don't find them counterintuitive, but even if it has like slightly counterintuitive, and many other people don't find them counterintuitive, even if it has certain strange properties, it doesn't follow that it's impossible. Show me, prove that it's impossible. Do it. Dare, I dare you to. They've never done it. They're just like, oh, it's weird. It's absurd. Okay, that's the strange and the impossible are different things. And
you've spoken about a bugbear of yours where people say that this stuff isn't, or where people say it's counterintuitive. The bugbear of mine is when people claim, and I know you don't self-identify as an atheist, Joe. You self-identify as agnostic, if I'm not mistaken. But I self-identify as an atheist, and one of the things that gets leveled at me and many atheists like me is that of being a know-it-all. And I find that to be very irritating, because I'm the one who's actually saying, let's have some epistemic humility here. Let's acknowledge that, hang on a minute, just because things operate a certain way in our reality, it doesn't mean that, you know, certain things are impossible, just because something is strange. And by the way, I extend that to gods and to everything else. Just because, you know, I don't know, an eternally existing, or let me give you an example of something that strikes me as radically counterintuitive. An incorporeal mind. That strikes me as radically counterintuitive. But it doesn't therefore follow that that's definitely not the case. I'm open to being convinced of the possibility of the existence of an incorporeal mind. That's something that's potentially on the cards. Who knows? I'm all about epistemic humility, and so when people try to use their experience of the finite to make judgments about infinite collections, and then they suggest, as Craig does, this is absurd, that's absurd. It seems like absurd is his favorite buzzword. That to me smells of, again, I don't want to be so strident, but it's a kind of almost like an intellectual arrogance. Like there's a lack of epistemic humility there, because like, who are you to say that this or that is absurd or impossible? Unless you can actually demonstrate a literal logical impossibility, which I think would be a reasonable thing to do, like square circles. I'm not convinced that they exist in any possible world. There's debate that people might have. I know there are people who say that true contradictions exist. It's just not a position I'm persuaded by. True, this sentence is false. They use linguistic examples and so on. I'm not persuaded by that case. But in any case, just because something is strange, as you put it, Joe, it doesn't mean that it's false. And all I would say to the listener and to those who are still perhaps not yet persuaded about the possibility, not the truth, I might add. I'm not claiming, as Joe inferred earlier, we're not trying to prove that an infinite past is possible. We're just showing that Craig hasn't ruled it out. Or we're certainly not claiming that an infinite past is true. We might be claiming that it's possible, at least, maybe. But yeah, the point is, just because it's strange doesn't mean that it's not true. Just because it's weird or has what some people might call counterintuitive properties, it doesn't follow that it's not true. But with that said, Joe, was there anything you wanted to respond to there before I table another potential problem with Hilbert's Hotel?
Yeah, no, I mean, not much that I want to add. I mean, I just want to at least help people see. I mean, like, there are many people who not only fail to find these features of actual infinites counterintuitive and whatnot, they actually find them like intuitively possible and like obviously not absurd. So this is one of like the best theist philosophers alive, Alexander Proust. I'm quoting him here. He says, quote, "I have a really hard time accepting the corollary that Hilbert's Hotel couldn't exist. That corollary seems extremely counterintuitive to me," end quote. Craig's claim that Hilbert's Hotel and other actual infinites cannot exist is actually counterintuitive for Proust. And like me, Proust just intuitively and obviously finds Hilbert's Hotel to be totally not absurd and to be totally innocuous. So, like, I don't know, like, that's something that they also need to reckon with. It's like, many people actually find these things, like, it's extremely intuitive that there could be actual infinites as well. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that.
Sure. So with that said, I have to table this. I just absolutely have to table this. And no conversation about Craig and his views on Hilbert's Hotel would be complete without this discussion. So wouldn't any problem with an infinite past as teased out by Hilbert's Hotel equally apply to an infinite future, which many theists, Craig included, believe in? I mean, if you're going to believe in an afterlife that is a heaven, an eternal afterlife, now maybe there's a way out of this by proposing that afterlife is timeless or something like that. Maybe there are solutions here. But there are infinities involved in the theological worldview, actual infinites involved in at least some subset of theological worldviews contain actual infinites. So wouldn't any alleged absurdity of actual infinites that Craig wants to attribute to a collection of past events, wouldn't they equally apply to any theistic actual infinite? And in which case, isn't Craig kind of shooting himself in the foot unwittingly? What say you, Joe?
Right. So in my view, that's definitely correct. Now, I'm not going to say that any argument against the impossibility of an infinite past is thereby going to be an argument against, for instance, the impossibility of God having infinitely many beliefs, or the impossibility of an endless future. But
sure.
Because there may very well be certain arguments that only target very specific features of the past in particular. But at least this argument, the argument from the impossibility of actual infinites, does indeed spill over and just like infect every other element of one's worldview. So like, yes. Craig's like pushed to, partly because of this, Craig has like pushed to like this radical kind of nominalism, at least my view, and a great many philosophers' views. Like, he denies the existence of numbers and properties and properties conceived of as universals, and all these other sorts of things that he has to deny the existence of sets, even though mathematicians seem to get along perfectly well with them, and they seem indispensable to lots of mathematical practice. And even though, like, anyway, we're not going to get into that a bunch. But like, anyway, if you deny the existence, even the possibility of actual infinites, you have to say that like there can't be numbers, that can't be properties. Because again, if there could be properties, then it seems like there could be infinitely many. There would have to be infinitely many of them. So, for instance, like the property of being, being 1 year old, the property being 2 years old, the property being 3 years old, the property being 4 years old. Each of those is going to be a property, even if they're not instantiated. Or like take the natural numbers, the natural number 1, the natural number 2, the natural number 3, the natural number 4, and so on ad infinitum. So like he has to deny the existence of numbers. He has to say there are no numbers between 5 and 10 because there are no numbers, and things like that. And nothing has. Anyway, not gonna get into that, but I just want to point out, like, he has to go to this pretty radical kind of nominalistic view because he denies actual infinites, and there are many good arguments, at least in my view, for the existence of like mathematical entities and things like that. So that's one where you could push back. He also, I mean, you might think that theism posits. I mean, theism does indeed posit an omniscient God, and like, what is it to be omniscient? Well, it's to know all truths, and so to believe all truths, and to believe no falsehoods. But like if you're believing all truths, I mean, there are infinitely many truths. For instance, here's a truth. I am not identical to 1 electron. I am not identical to 2 electrons. I am not identical to 3 electrons. I am not identical to 4 electrons.
Indeed.
Or, 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 2 = 3, 1 + 3 = 4, 1 + 4 = 5, and so on and so on. So there are infinitely many of these things, and God's going to have to believe all of them. So it seems like God has to have infinitely many beliefs. Now, of course, Craig tries to get out of this by saying, and I'll get onto the endless future in just a second.
Sure.
Craig has to say, no, well, technically speaking, God doesn't have these distinct beliefs, so we have to have this kind of strange view of God where really God just has this like one act of like direct awareness by which he comprehends all of reality. He doesn't have like distinct beliefs or something like that.
Yeah, I find that hugely problematical.
Right, and I mean, in my video, I go through different potential problems for that, and you know, people have criticized, different, even theistic philosophers again have criticized this on several fronts. So like, you know, it's, as you can see, it's like infecting his worldview. It's to take all these stands on these like separate topics that like have many independent challenges against them.
It's increasing the intellectual price tag.
Yeah, it is significantly increasing the intellectual price tag. Yes. And it's opening himself up to a whole concoction of objections to each of these views that he has to saddle himself with, and so on. But yeah, perhaps one of the most serious ones is that like Christianity seems to posit an endless afterlife, such that if there can't be an endless future, then Christianity is false. And so that's why in my video I basically say Craig is committed to the falsity of Christianity. Craig has refuted Christianity, because if his argument succeeds, then there can't be an endless future. If there can't be an endless future, well, if Christianity were true, then there would be an endless future, namely an endless afterlife, which we enjoy with God or in heaven or maybe in hell or whatever. So, because there can't be such a thing, and Christianity implies such a thing, it follows that Christianity is false. Now,
because
of course,
you could put the days in heaven into one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, couldn't you?
Right, that's exactly what I was getting to.
Oh, sorry, so, forgive me, Joe. Yeah, proceed then. Sorry.
No, it's all good. No, you're anticipating things. It's great. So yeah, I mean, the basic thrust of this is that, as I explain painstakingly in the video, and I respond to basically everything that Craig has said in response to this, an endless future is indeed an actual infinite, in the sense that an endless future is a collection of items, namely future days or future hours or future minutes or future events or whatever. It's a collection of items which can be paired in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. And so it has Cantor's property. You can pair tomorrow with the number 1. You can pair the day after with the number 2. You can pair the day after that with the number 3. You can pair the day after that with the number 4, and so on ad infinitum. You can't find a natural number which won't be paired with some future day. I mean, pick some arbitrary natural number. 4,812. Well, that will be paired with the day, which is 4,812 days from now. Or pick the natural number 14 quadrillion and 7. Well, 14 quadrillion and 7 is going to be paired with the day 14 quadrillion and 7 days from now. And we can do this for any arbitrary natural number. And what strictly deductively, logically, and inescapably follows from this is that each natural number is paired with a unique future day. And there are infinitely many natural numbers. And it just strictly follows from that, logically, inescapably, that the number of future days, that is the number of days later than today, the number of days that will occur, all of them, can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. And since there are infinitely many natural numbers, and so it follows that there are infinitely many days, each of which will occur. No one is saying, let me repeat, no one is saying that there will ever come a time at which someone has gotten to the end of the endless future and they're saying, yes, I've finally gone through all of the infinitely many days that comprise the future. No one is saying that. No one is saying there will ever come a time at which infinitely many days have transpired. Instead, we're talking about all the days that are later than today. All the days which are such that that day will occur.
Is an
How many
infinite
of those
collection.
are there?
There's an infinite
Yes,
collection.
as I just explained,
It's undeniable.
Collection.
It's undeniable.
Well, in my view, it is. But
I've seen Craig. Was it Alex Malpass put him on the spot with this question and said, Dr. Craig, how many days will occur in the future? And Craig just kept like changing the subject by saying how many days will have occurred. He kept saying,
exactly.
If at any point you stop someone and ask them, it would be day 500. It would be day 1001. It would be. Yeah, but that's not. I didn't ask you how many days will there have been. I asked you, how many days beyond this day will there be in the sum total of the infinite future or what have you? And the obvious answer is there will be infinitely many days in the future. But he just, it was almost like he was just refusing to answer the question because it's problematic for his worldview.
It seems to me that this is a subtle point, but it was very important for this, right? That I think Bill switches from the future tense to the future perfect tense when he's talking about the accumulation of things over time as it increases towards infinity as a limit without ever getting there. And I think that when he says that the future is potentially infinite, he's saying the number of events that will have been, which is the future perfect tense, is always finite and increases as time passes. And so here's an analogy. I think if you were to imagine, say, putting a marble into a jar every day that goes past, right? Once a day you put a marble into a jar. Let's say you do it at midnight. As time passes, you'd be putting more and more marbles into this jar. And the number of marbles in the jar would increase. It would always be finite, but it would be increasing. And if time continued like that forever, there'd always be a finite number of marbles in the jar, but that number would be increasing forever, approaching infinity, but it would never actually get there, right? So the number of marbles in the jar would be a potential infinite. But then you've got to ask yourself, what is the number of the jar counting, right? It's counting the days that have been, right, at that point. At any point, if I look at the jar, and each one of them corresponds to a day that's in the past as of that moment, right? So what's increasing potentially infinitely, is the past, right? The future, or wherever I'm getting these marbles from, some big pile of marbles that's in front of me, that's the future. It's not the marbles in the jar, right? It's the marbles that I'm taking out of them. And if I can keep taking marbles forever and putting them in the jar, there has to be an infinite number of marbles in front of me, right? That's the future. Bill wants to talk about the marbles that are in the jar, right? But I think that he's just switching from the future tense to the future perfect tense when he does that. And it feels to me once you get your tenses in order, then that whole objection, it stops being a symmetry breaker. It's effectively changing subject from what the question was about. But I know we disagree about that, and it would be nice to talk more about that. We could talk about that exact point, I think, for a couple of hours without really getting much further with it. But I mean, I'm very interested to hear what your reply to that is, if you can spend a moment outlining what you think about that.
I can say just one thing, and that is, I think your own illustration shows there will never be an infinite number of marbles in the jar.
Will never have been.
I do not mean simply there will not have been, but there will not be an infinite number of marbles in the jar. So it is simply false that there will be an actually infinite number of events. It will always be finite.
Well, okay, that's a number of events, because as I said, each marble in the jar corresponds to a day that's passed. So, and I agree with you, the past will never be actually infinite. But we're talking about the future, right? The marbles I haven't put in the jar yet.
There are no such marbles.
Well,
I mean, we're talking here, remember, temporal becoming is real. The marbles need to come into being. It's not as though you've got a pile of future marbles. We're talking about temporal becoming, right?
Okay, so let's suppose the marbles pop into existence just before I drop them into the jar, right?
Right.
How many marbles will pop into existence, right?
How many will infinite number, a potentially infinite number, but there will never be an infinite number of marbles that pop into existence.
I still feels that's not right. The number of if I ask how many, as of any time, how many marbles will I have put in the jar, then I agree with you, potentially infinite. But the ones that I will put in, how many will pop into existence that I'll put in the jar? If I never stop doing it, then I will put, there is an actually infinite amount of marbles that will be put in the jar, even though there's no time.
No, that's not true. There will never be an infinite number of marbles that you put into the jar. All you have here is a potential infinite, increasing toward infinity as a limit, but the infinity is never instantiated, ever. And it doesn't do any good to change to the past or the future perfect. The pure future is enough.
As Malpass and Morrison point out in their paper Endless and Infinite, published in Philosophical Quarterly, I believe, they point out that Craig, throughout the years, has systematically confused this question with a different question, namely, how many days will there have been as the moving now progresses throughout the future? Now, Craig is actually correct. Here's something that Craig is spot on correct about. Craig is correct that if we're asking how many days will there have been as the moving now progresses throughout the future, that is always finite, and it's always increasing without bound toward infinity as a limit. So that is a potential infinite. So like as the moving now, as the present gets to like 2028, how many days, if we're asking in 2023, well, how many days will there have been when time gets to 2028? Well, 5, or how many years? 5 years, right? That's a finite number, because that's how many days there will have been as of 2028. As the moving now progresses, it is always only finitely many days will have occurred by that time.
Yes.
So Craig is spot on that is a potential infinite collection. But that's not the collection that we're asking about when we ask about how many days will there be simpliciter. It's the simple future tense. We're talking about all the days in the future of today. We're not asking how many days will there have been as of the moving now progressing. Yeah, that's finite. That's always finite, and it's always increasing. But that's not what we're talking about. If you say that there are only finitely many days that will occur, then you're committed to there being an end. If you say it's, for instance, 412, there are exactly 412 days that will occur and no more. Well, then, as we're getting closer, day 411, day 412, that's going to be the end of the world because you just said that there will only be 412 days left in reality. You are committed then to time ending in 412 days. So if you say that it's some finite number, any finite number you pick, then time's going to have to come to an end. And so if you're committed to time not coming to an end, it follows that it can't be any finite number. Notice also, let me just make this one more point.
Yeah, no, sorry, go ahead. No, be my guest.
It's focused on the collection of future years. So that is the years that will occur. The years that are later than right now. If that collection were a potential infinite, notice what a potential infinite is. A potential infinite is a collection which always has finitely many members, and it's always increasing in the number of members that it has. But hold on a second. This collection is not always increasing in the number of members that it has. Okay, so let's start right now. It's 2024, okay? The future years as of 2024, that collection includes 2025, includes 2026, includes 2027, includes 2028, and so on. Now, suppose that time progresses to 2025. Well, now we can ask, what does the collection of future years look like? Well, it only includes now 2026. Right? It doesn't include 2025 because we're supposing 2025 is present, right? So it only includes 2026 and 2027 and 2028 and so on. So notice then that the collection of future days has not grown as time progresses. We just removed an element. We removed 2025.
Yes.
We removed an element. Yes. That is not growth. And similarly, when we go to 2026, now the collection of future days. Yeah. Now the collection of future days or future years is 2027, 2028, 2029, and so on. Okay? Notice, again, that the collection of future days has not grown as time progresses. We just removed, not only did we remove 2025, we've also removed 2026. And now the collection only contains 2027, 2028, 2029, and so on. So the collection of future years does not increase over time. But notice what a necessary condition on being a potential infinite is. This is exactly how Craig defines it in his work. It's a collection that is always finite, but always increasing toward infinity as a limit. That is a near quote. A near quote.
For most of Western world history, the only concept of the infinite that was available was that of a potential infinite. This is the idea of a collection which has a finite number of members, but is always increasing limitlessly, or rather with infinity as a limit. It is increasing endlessly with infinity as a limit.
This collection that I just specified, the collection of future years, is not increasing as time progresses. And so it is not a potential infinite. That is inescapable. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm off my high horse.
So definitionally, the future cannot be considered a potential infinite, because a potential infinite, by Craig's own admission,
right?
An endless future. Sorry, yes, an endless future cannot be a potential infinite, because by Craig's own admission, a potential infinite is a series that we add to, but never actually get. It tends towards infinity, but we never actually get there. But we are just adding over time, but we will never get to infinity. But that's not what's happening with events in the future. If anything, I know we want to stay away from the word subtraction, which we never get into, and I know what you're referring to.
We're removing years from the collection.
We're removing years, and yet, interestingly, almost like Hilbert's Hotel, we still have an infinite number of days to occur.
We still have 2027 and 2028 and 2029 and 2030 and 2040 and so on. Ad infinitum. Yes, it is so patently clear. Like, once you think about it, once you recognize it, it is so patently clear that there are infinitely many. Aleph, Null, many. This can be paired in one-to-one correspondence to natural numbers.
Yeah.
There are infinitely many in this collection.
So the future, the endless future, is an actual infinite, not a potential infinite, because potential infinites tend towards infinity through successive addition, but never actually get there. We're not actually adding events to the future. We are removing days from the future, and yet we still have infinitely many days remaining in the endless future, which also teases out a Hilbert's Hotel-like absurdity as well for an endless future, which would be a problem for anybody who wants to believe in an endless paradise or future in heaven as well. So there's multiple ways in which this works as a problem for Craig's view, or for anybody who has the view that an infinite collection of past events is impossible.
Yeah, and if I can just interject, like, if people want to, because again, like Craig says some things in response to this, and the responses do not work at all. I systematically address them in the video, the Hilbert's Hotel and Analysis or whatever, as well as my, this one I haven't mentioned yet, my video, New Objections to the Kalam Still Work. I think that's the title. So I'd highly recommend checking that out.
I want to be respectful of your time, Joe, because I know.
Yeah, just one more question. Maybe like 5 to 10 more minutes.
No, I know. I want to be respectful of your time, so I actually only have 2 more quick points. One is, and I'll just tell you them now, and then you can go and you can tell me your thoughts, and then we'll wrap up. So, number 1 is, do you think the suggestion that paradise is timeless solves any of these problems regarding an infinite or an endless future in paradise? Do you think that solves the problem? And number 2, which is a question I get all the time in my comments, if the past is infinite, how did we ever get to the present? Those were the final 2 things I wanted to ask you, Joe. And if you could give me those responses, I would be so incredibly grateful. And then we'll table the discussion there, my friend. And thanks again for joining me, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are great questions. On the first question, what if we conceive of the endless afterlife as a kind of timeless existence? So I think in my video, the one that I just recommended, the one where it's like New Objections to the Kalam Still Succeed, I give like several responses to this proposal that, what if we don't conceive of the endless future? What if we don't conceive of the afterlife as a kind of endless temporal progression? What if we just say it's like a timeless sort of thing? There are a few things to say. One is that, at least in my view, this decidedly conflicts with the Christian tradition and how they've just sort of traditionally understood it and how it's described in the Bible and so on. So I mean, they can kind of maintain commitment to an endless afterlife in heaven, kind of in letter, but not in spirit. So I think it's a hollow victory. That's one thing to say. I just don't think this is how it's been conceived of in the tradition or in the Bible. The second thing to say is that it's just part of Christianity, as I understand it, that there's going to be a resurrection of the body. This is exactly, I think, what Paul talks about. There's a resurrection of the body, but like bodies, I mean, it's like a flesh and blood, like human body and a brain and things like that. Like these just don't seem to be things that could exist timelessly. Like just our bodies are just intimately bound up with time. They undergo various changes and so on. So I think it's all clear what like.
I think it's Augustine who talks about physical resurrection. I think Paul is more of a spiritual resurrection proponent. He would certainly talk about physical resurrection of Christ, but I think when it comes to human beings, I think he's more a champion of spiritual resurrection. I could be mistaken there. My
right. So yeah, I'm not a Bible scholar, and I'm not a Paul scholar. So
no, sure,
take
but
that part with a grain of salt.
The point is, though, you're right. There are very many Christians who would agree with Augustine that resurrection is a physical event, that the body is restored and brought back to its former glory, or something like that. Yeah,
exactly.
Anyway,
and given that, it seems like our endless future with God can't be a timeless sort of thing, because bodies just don't seem to be the sorts of things that can exist timelessly. So that's the second thing. And like they just wouldn't function as like human bodies. Like like digestion takes time. Like our
Yes.
our thought takes time. Like I don't know. Like we have eyes. Like if we blink, like or like these things are processes. Like bodies undergo processes. They take time. None of that makes sense timelessly. Like we just have to be like frozen and just like timelessness. Like and like our brains would be totally frozen. And like anyway, I don't think it makes much sense. So that's another thing. It seems to conflict with the resurrection of the body. A still third thing that's arguably problematic about this is that they could go one of two ways. They could either say somehow we like become timeless, because like we're temporal right now, right? So like somehow we transition to a state of timelessness. It's hard to make sense of that, because if it's a state of timelessness, it can't stand in temporal relations to things. It can't be like earlier than or later than things, or it can't be before or after things. But like if we transition to the state of timelessness, it seems like it's after our earthly period, right? So then it just doesn't seem to make sense. If it's timeless, it can't stand in temporal relations. But this proposal seems to require that it stands in temporal relations, because it seems to be after our earthly lives. We are first earthly and we're first temporal, and then we become timeless after we've gone through this temporal period and we've either behaved well or we've behaved poorly. So I don't think it makes sense for that reason. I think the way that they could get out of this is to say no, we don't actually become timeless. We've sort of like kind of always just kind of like timelessly existed, either with God in heaven or with God in hell, or like without God in hell. And that is just that seems implausible, seems to be in conflict with the Christian tradition. Like you and I have existed alongside God from timeless eternity, even before the foundations of the world. What? Like if you told like Christians that, they'd be like, that's not true. We have not just like timelessly existed with God from like timeless eternity. Even as we're causally, let's say, I don't want to say causally prior, but even like, anyway, I just don't like, it's God who is existing alone for Craig, timeless sans creation.
Yes.
But like, given the dialectic that I just traced out, if they want to say that we don't actually transition to a state of timelessness because that's incoherent, it would require our timeless state to be after our temporal state, which doesn't make sense. If they want to avoid that, they'd have to say that we have just kind of always just timelessly been there with God. And so actually, in God's timeless state, sans creation, like, or sans the beginning of Metro time, we were just hanging out with God there as well. So we have existed. In fact, we've always been timeless, and we're just like there with God, vibing, but like just. Anyway,
suffice to say, this stretches credulity to enormous lengths.
Right. Well, it strains credulity, and also it just seems like so patently contrary to everything that Christianity teaches about God's unique status as like the one thing that has timelessly existed from like eternity, right? Like It's God who is eternal. We are not. We have not existed from timeless eternity. But this proposal that I just said, on which we don't become timeless, would require us to also exist from timeless eternity with God, which that's bordering on like sacrilegious for them. So anyway, so there are many problems with that proposal, and I just don't think it works. And then the next thing that you mentioned was I actually forgot the next thing.
The final question was, it's something I see in my comments all of the time. I can tell you my response to it, and I would love to know if you think it's a good response. But the question is, if the past is infinite, how do we ever get to the present? Because you can't traverse an infinite collection to get to the end of it. And my response was always to say, and you can tell me if this is a good response, it always was persuasive to me. I would always respond by asking a question to these people. I would say, tell me a point in the infinite past that would make it impossible for me to get to the present. And the only response they seem to be able to offer is, you can't get from infinity to the present. But I would remind them that infinity isn't a number, it's a concept. And so they seem to be kind of engaged in some kind of a category error or something by treating infinity like it's a number. Am I completely wrong-headed there, Joe, or not? And how would you respond to it? How do we arrive in the present if the past is infinite? That's my last question.
I think it depends. I think it depends on the interlocutor and how they're pushing the argument, whether or not that's like a good response. I certainly think it's a good response to the way that at least many people have leveled the argument. So, I mean, yeah, there are a lot of things to say on this argument. I've also done videos about this in my Kalam playlist, so if people are curious, they can check it out. I did one, for instance, with Wes Morstan on the successive addition argument, which is basically this sort of thing. A few things to say. Firstly, as you've presented it, and as oftentimes they present it, it's just like a question. Cool, good question. Where's your argument? I really don't care, right? Like, what you got this question. Well, how can you get to the present if the past is infinite? Well, I mean, like, okay, what's your argument? Are you positively claiming that we can't? Well, I think that. Try to justify that, please. So, like, questions aren't themselves arguments. They might be interesting. Sure. They might invite us to think about things, but that's not itself an objection to an infinite past. Just asking, well, how could we get to the present if the past is infinite? A good question. Maybe I don't have an answer. How does that show that the past can't be infinite? It doesn't. So, I mean, that's one thing. It's just if they put it in terms of question. If they put it in terms of an argument, like, they have a premise. You can't get to the present if the past is infinite. You can't sort of traverse through the whole thing. I ask, why not? What's the justification for that? I don't see any reason to accept that that's true. And almost always, the way that they try to justify it is like, well, you can't count to infinity. Well, sure, but that involves having a definite starting point and then trying to like get to the end of an endless process. But you can't get to the end of an endless process. It's endless, right? So like you can't start and then like start from a definite point and then like traverse like an entire infinite future or something and then get to the end of the infinite future or something like that and look back and say, oh yes, I started at a point and then went through infinitely many days and then got to a point after that. Okay, yeah, I kind of agree that you can't do that. But that's not what an infinite past is. You don't start at a point and then traverse through infinitely many days and then get to another point after that. That's not how it works. You don't start from a point. So it's relevantly dissimilar to counting up to infinity. And sometimes they'll say, well, if you can't count up to infinity, well, then you can't count down from infinity. But why should I accept that? Why should I accept that those are why should I accept that there's a generalization from one to the other? And I actually have a relevant dissimilarity between them. The reason why you can't count up to infinity is because there's no end to that. There's an endless process. To count up to it, you'd have to get to the end of an endless thing. You can't do that, right? But notice that reason for the impossibility there does not transfer to the impossibility of counting down from infinity, because there is an end to that, right?
I love that.
It's not endless. There is an end to it.
So there's a symmetry breaker. There's a symmetry breaker.
Well, yeah, there's a relevant difference between them that accounts for why one of them would be impossible while the other one may not be.
Because getting from the past to the present is going from infinity back to zero, whereas going from zero to infinity is the opposite. So there's
right. Well, yeah, going from zero to quote unquote infinity. I mean, there isn't like an infinity of natural number or something like that. Right?
Sure.
So like they're asking us to get to the end of an endless process, which again you can't do. But that reason for the impossibility of counting up to infinity is not present in the case of counting down from infinity, because there is an endpoint that you can get to. Now they might say, well, but there's no beginning. Okay, yeah, there's no beginning, but why on earth would that make it impossible? Unless you just beg the question that you can't have a beginningless past and traverse to the present, then I don't see any justification for accepting the view. Ultimately, I think this is how this is played out in literature. This just bottoms out in a flat assertion that you just can't traverse an infinite past and get to the present. It just bottoms out in a flat assertion, and I don't see any reason to accept that. And yeah, it doesn't seem intuitive to me. I've come across no good reason to think that that's true. And yet another thing, and this is the final thing that I'll say, is that this arguably assumes what is called an A theory of time, on which there is a kind of genuine dynamism or objective becoming in reality. Time kind of flows from past to present to future. Whereas if we conceive of time as a kind of static four-dimensional block that's just there, it's just always kind of just existing there, just spread out, kind of like space, but more like kind of like a temporal dimension that's just there. All times equally exist. They're all equally real. There's no kind of like genuine passage from one time to another. If we take that sort of view of time, well, then no one's like, and nothing is like traversing an infinite past. It's not like time is like flowing from past to the present to the future. There's no individual which is like moving from the infinite past all the way to the present. It's all just kind of extended out there. It's basically as if space were like infinite in the spatial direction. No one is like traversing space or something like that. Like, you're not like nothing is like going from the end of, or going from one spatial point and like somehow going through all the other infinitely many spatial regions or something. That's so like if you have a B theory of time or something like that, which is more popular in philosophy at least than the A theory of time, and more popular among physicists as well. If you have that sort of view, then you could still, in principle, have an infinite past, because so much as this argument says, because nothing is actually traversing anything. Time isn't traversing anything. Nothing in time is traversing anything. So the argument assumes, basically, this is what I'm saying. The argument assumes an A theory of time, but that is like monumentally controversial, and there are lots of objections to it. And it's just increasing the intellectual price tag of an argument if it requires you to accept this monumentally controversial thesis about time, for which there are many independent objections. So that's another thing to say. And of course, they'd also have to roll up their sleeves and demonstrate this view, because it's an assumption of their argument that the A theory of time is true, because otherwise there is no traversal.
That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed as such, Joe Schmid.
Right.
And
exactly.
I can't think of a better note to finish on, actually, not least because that quote is a quote from one of my intellectual heroes, Christopher Hitchens. So, Joe, it has been an absolute honor and a privilege. It has tested my epistemic limits. There's a few points in this conversation where I was tripping over myself, getting confused. And you know what? I'm actually excited for my audience to see that, because my edited content where I'm not speaking with a guest is usually very, very smooth and very, very competently spoken and so on. I don't trip over myself, generally speaking, because I do a lot of research, as you do, before I make a video and so on. But this conversation, I wanted to have it for many reasons. It's a topic that fascinates me. I've always been a fan of yours. Always is a strong word. Clearly, I haven't existed infinitely. So
from eternity
always.
past, from timeless eternity, you've timelessly just been enjoying my content, just bathing in it, just frozen, just enjoying Majesty of Reason.
Indeed. So no, I've been a fan of yours for quite a while. And I wanted to have that conversation for this reason. But also, there are certain questions I had about this topic and how best to respond to certain challenges and so on. And all I can say is that you've helped me enormously, both in this podcast and in the past from viewing your content, in terms of that goal of just making me a better philosopher and better preparing me for dealing with challenges to my worldview and my position and so on, as well as helping me to change my mind in areas that I was mistaken, which is a goal that everybody should have in mind, to be reflexive and so on. So in any case, this is a very long and bloviated thank you, but I'm just really, really grateful for you joining me here today, Joe. And thank you for being so generous with your time. I know we ran over there by about 10 minutes or so, but it has really been a treat for me, and thank you so much. And I hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciated it. And yeah, we'll stay in touch. Thanks.
Fantastic, Joe. I really appreciate it.